Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Bruegel event entitled The Contribution of Hydrogen to European Decarbonisation. First, let me pass on apologies from Georg Zachman, Senior Fellow at Bruegel, who was supposed to moderate today, but has called in sick this morning without any voice, so difficult for him to moderate. And I am stepping in instead to moderate for him. I am Ben McWilliams, Research Analyst at Bruegel, and earlier this year, we co-authored a paper entitled Navigating Through Hydrogen, where we tried to set the scene a bit in our perspective on how hydrogen stands in Europe and investigate some of the policy questions, which I hope today we are going to get further into. So it's very exciting and nice for me to be able to join. Today, we are joined by a really esteemed set of panelists. We have policymakers from both sides of the channel, which is nice, as well as industry and policy experts. We are joined by Alison Comboy, who is the Deputy Director of Hydrogen Production at BASE, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department of the UK. Hi, Alison. We are joined by Ruud Kempener, who is Policy Officer in the Unit Renewables and Energy Systems Integration of DG ENA. Hi, Ruud. We are joined by Andrea Pisano, who is the Head of Hydrogen Initiatives at ENI. And Andrea. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Matthias Deutsch, who is the Program Lead for Hydrogen at the Agora Institute in Germany. Hi, Matthias. I think that hydrogen is a really obviously a fascinating topic, and one of the things that makes it so interesting is that there are two different perspectives for looking at hydrogen, from the demand side and the supply side, which require different thought processes, but it's impossible to separate them out. You need to consider both at the same time in these kind of discussions. And by that I mean, on the demand side, clearly the question is, what role can hydrogen play in decarbonisation? We don't want to consume hydrogen or use hydrogen for the sake of it, but where does it make sense to use it, and how can it help us achieve our ambitious decarbonisation goals? And on the other hand, hydrogen is different from the last century of fossil fuel consumption, where we found these things in the ground, dug them up and consumed them. Hydrogen does not exist naturally in the environment, and first we have to produce it or transform it from other fuels. And this leads to lots of controversy. Many of you will have heard of the hydrogen rainbow and all the different colours that exist for describing different forms of hydrogen, which the Commission likes to move away and comes up with their own terminologies. But here there's a lot of complexity and a lot of debate to be had. But amongst all this complexity, from industry, we know that there needs to be clear and stable signals for the kind of investments that we need to come forward. And that's in Europe and in the UK. I think we're now getting to this stage where strategies have been put forward, and over the next 1-2 years, these need to be transformed into legislation and into real policies. And this is in areas of infrastructure, policy support schemes, coverage under the ETS or the UK ETS, taxonomy, import questions. I mean, there's a great deal of questions which need to be addressed so that industry can get on with whichever actions they need to take. And today we have only 1 hour for this discussion, so I think we will not get really into the specifics, but try to remain on a bit of a higher level and discuss some of the key themes that emerge here. Before handing over to our first speaker, let me point you as the audience to Slido, where we will take questions and post them to our panelists. If you're watching on the Bruegel website, you should see just beneath this video stream an option to put in your question. And if not, you can navigate to Slido, sli.do, and use the event code hydrogen and put your questions there. So now let me first hand over to Alison, as I say, the Deputy Director of Hydrogen Production in BASE. In the UK, there's an interesting theme for hydrogen development. I mean, with the oil and gas expertise, there's a different perspective potentially from some EU countries. And as we discussed before, you've had a very busy week with the net zero strategy and others coming out from the UK, and some really exciting developments. So yeah, about, if you can, in 6-7 minutes ish, and over to you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks very much for having me. Thanks everyone for listening. And so, as Ben mentions, I'm Alison Conboy. I'm a Deputy Director in BEIS, which is our Business and Energy Department where climate change policy also sits. And I think I'm here for two reasons, really. So one is just a kind of case study of a European country that's really embracing hydrogen in the economy. But also hopefully not just as a kind of distant academic case study, but because the UK's got such a rich history in energy trade and energy cooperation with our European colleagues, partners, neighbours. So certainly that's something we're keen to see continue as we move forward in the hydrogen economy too. So with that in mind and recognising time is tight, I thought I'd just cover three things briefly and happy to pick up more in questions. So one is a little bit about our strategy for hydrogen in the UK. The second is the role that we see here for different technologies. So I guess our take on the hydrogen rainbow, as you called it. And then finally, just some early thoughts on trade. So first, the UK's strategy. So I guess we're saying we see a major role for hydrogen in the economy. And that's something that both government and the Independent Climate Change Committee think. So we have a net zero target for 2050 in the UK, and both we and the Climate Change Committee think that hydrogen is going to be an essential part of meeting that target. So just this week, we published our net zero strategy, which is the policies and proposals that get us to that 2050 target, as well as the kind of interim carbon budgets, which pave the way for us to get there. And so we do see there's a lot of hydrogen in the net zero strategy, as Ben mentioned. So kind of to give you a sense, by 2050, we're expecting to be using somewhere between 240 and 500 terawatt hours of hydrogen, so quite a lot. And I guess, I mean, the kind of context I always have in mind is that's not miles off the power system today in the UK. So we're talking about by 2050 having kind of replaced, having built something that from almost kind of zero base of having of low carbon hydrogen, something that's kind of roughly the size of the electricity sector right now. So it's a big job between now and 2050. And in terms of end use, we're expecting that to be used fairly widely. So industry, power, building, transportation, in all those areas, we know there are kind of, it's likely to be areas where electricity is hard to kind of meet all your decarbonisation needs, and we think there's a role for hydrogen there. And in August, we actually published a big hydrogen strategy that lays out a little bit how we see those end users development. So that's kind of a slightly longer term picture. In terms of short term ambitions, we've got a lot out there as well. So last year, our Prime Minister announced an intention to have 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen capacity by 2030. So again, from a kind of near zero base in terms of low carbon hydrogen production now, we want to be at 5 gigawatts by 2030, which would give us about kind of 40, 45 terawatt hours, depending on your load factors. And just this week, in fact, we announced a new package of revenue support. So we're going to start awarding contracts. So this is kind of long-term support for hydrogen production. And we're actually consulting right now on the policy instrument to do that. We're minded to a sort of CFD, contract for difference style model. And we've said that we will award the first 250 megawatts of contracts for electrolytic projects in 2023, with a view to having a further allocation round and having 500 megawatts online or in construction by 2025. So this is really taking off. And alongside that, also, we've announced our intention to have up to 1 gigawatt of blue, so CCUS-enabled hydrogen, with contracts from 2023. So we are really starting to kind of kick off in earnest now. So just that, I'll stop there on the strategy, but happy to talk a bit more. Just briefly on technology, I think we do have a lot of interest in that. So perhaps worth saying that the UK's approach has for a while been to take a kind of twin track approach. So we talk about supporting both electrolytic or green hydrogen and also CCUS enabled or blue hydrogen. And that's something that the government is supportive of, but also our Independent Climate Change Committee. And there's a couple of drivers there. So one is assets, and I think you mentioned this already. So we see ourselves as very well positioned to play in both of those areas. So on the electrolytic side, you'll know, we have the largest offshore wind sector in the world at the moment. But also on the CCUS side, we have some really good natural geological assets. So, and we know that UK companies are at the forefront of both of these technologies. So there's definitely a kind of using our assets perspective. Also from a strategic perspective, though, it's not just about assets. We really see those technologies as complementary. So particularly as we face the challenge of kind of scaling up this economy. So I mentioned the green, but I think also worth saying kind of in the near term, we do think the kind of production at scale, low cost and low carbon that comes from CCUS enabled hydrogen is going to be really important. And we also think that will bring forward investment right across the value chain that will benefit everybody. So stimulating demand, stimulating confidence in the sector, pulling a range of hydrogen technologies through to commercialisation. We think that all production pathways will benefit from having that scale over the 2020s. And just kind of final note here is, of course, I've talked about kind of blue and green hydrogen, but we don't think they're the only production methods likely to play a role. So we think technologies that are maybe less established now also have a kind of important role in the future. And I think the important thing for us is this is why we're consulting at the moment on having a single low carbon standard for all technologies. So this is about making sure that government support only goes to technologies that meet a greenhouse gas emissions threshold. So trying to make sure that we kind of embrace the technologies, new technologies as they come forward as well, but making sure that we're only supporting technologies that can play a role in that net zero goal. So I'll stop there on technologies, but again, happy to speak more in questions. And just final thing from me, I think, is just a quick word on trade. So as I've said, we see the UK as ambitious on hydrogen, but we're certainly not alone. And we're really pleased to see that many countries have signalled the importance of hydrogen in reducing emissions. So we expect that there will be a global market for trade in hydrogen. And I guess one thing I'd say about that is we think it will take some time for that market to come into effect, but we know that the rules that shape that market will be agreed much sooner. And I think the one thing we'd say is we're really keen to make sure that all of us as kind of policymakers are anticipating that and making sure that the rules we make now can kind of look forward to those future markets. So for example, in our standard for low carbon hydrogen, it's really important for us to make sure that only hydrogen that can deliver genuine carbon benefits is produced in the UK. And we've also been looking carefully at kind of similar schemes globally, and we do think there's a lot of potential for that standard to be developed, for example, into a certification scheme that could support trade in the future. So yeah, that's a kind of how we view it, is we should be thinking now about future trade because the markets will be here before we know it, I'm sure. So I'll kind of finish there. I think hopefully that's been helpful. Happy to speak more. I'm really keen to be working with our international friends and partners as we see this kind of economy materialise.
Thank you very much, Alison. Very interesting. I think particularly today on trade with Europe and UK at the table, that's a really interesting question that we hopefully we'll get into later. But let me now hand over to Ruud Kempener, as I mentioned, from the European Commission. He was, I think, quite instrumental in drafting the hydrogen strategy. And I think he has also lots more work on his plate, as later this year there's the gas directive, among other legislations coming forward relating to hydrogen. So over to you, Ruud, for some opening remarks and your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ben, and Alison for the introduction of the UK plans as well. Indeed, I'm going to try to use my 7 minutes wisely as well. And I wanted to pick up, Ben, on your introductory words and really kind of focus a little bit on demand and supply. Because I think in July 2020, when we published our hydrogen strategy, we actually had a specific chapter on that, supply and demand. And the big question then, and still is, how to resolve this chicken and egg problem. How to give the confidence to the investors in the production of hydrogen, that there will be a market for them at a later stage, and how to ensure that those consumers, which need to do big investments and need to kind of decarbonize, for example, their industrial processes, that there is sufficient hydrogen there for them in order to enable that. So the proposal which we've come up with a year later, which was in the Fit for 55 package, is really to kind of put in place a target for the consumption of renewable hydrogen in 2030. And we think that timeline between now and 2030 gives sufficient time for a market which is indeed very, very nascent, and large production sites are not there yet to develop, and at the same time enable those hard to decarbonize sectors, and here we specifically focus on industry and the transport sector, to kind of focus on these specific parts where we know that investments in the next decade will be there in 2050. So if they can already incorporate in those decisions a kind of a future-proof investment decisions where hydrogen is needed, then we can satisfy both the producers and the demand side with the hydrogen. Now, this is also why in the hydrogen strategy itself, we really saw kind of a phased approach. The first 5 years to 2025, really a first upscaling of the market. We still need to do a lot of demonstration projects. We're working with kind of our Rise in Europe projects already to scale up to the hundreds of megawatts in terms of electrolyzers, but also indeed to already start on this demand case. How are you going to use that hydrogen, transport it and deliver it to the end consumer? And then again, after 2025 to 2030, we see another step change where we do think that the electrolyzers will be mature and we can develop them not only on site where the hydrogen will be used, but that we will have at some places already some infrastructure available, either the existing infrastructure or new repurposed infrastructure to help deliver this match between supply and demand. I think it's also important, and Alison, you use terawatt hours, so I'm going to use terawatt hours as well. It's always difficult to know which unit to use. So that in terms of the demand which we're thinking about, it's around 250 terawatt hours in 2050. So you need quite a lot of 2030. So you need quite a lot of renewable power for that already to make that happen. But if we look at 2050, of course, scenarios run quite wild. But in all of the cases, we're talking about more than 1,500 terawatt hours in Europe. We ourselves are looking at about 2,200 terawatt hours. Some very ambitious studies go even beyond that, and they go to the 3,500 terawatt hours. But in any case, it means that the market which we're creating in 2030 is less than 10% what we need in 2050. And here, I think also from a policy perspective, we have to keep that in mind, that the big scale up will happen in the period from 2030 to 2050. So what we really want to do with this Fit for 55 package is to make and enable that also that scale up after 2030 to happen, such that we can, of course, achieve our climate neutrality targets in 2050. And I think if we now look at the Fit for 55 package, one of our ideas is already that hydrogen, like you said before, is not an objective in itself. It needs to be part of this integrated energy system. And that's why within the Fit for 55 package, we have these demand targets, which is the one hand side of things, including kind of specific policies to push it into these hard to decarbonize applications like maritime and in aviation, etc., and in industry, of course. We already establishing the certification because we do think that indeed it's going to be a consumer-driven market. So you need to make sure that the consumer knows what he or she is buying. But we're also at the same time looking at this production part of things. So with the extension of the European emissions trading scheme and including kind of large-scale hydrogen production in there, that also ensures kind of that the production of hydrogen is promoted. But also taxation, another element which we've already put in our Fit for 55 package, because I think that's also a very important element of this integrated energy system. And then, of course, like you said, we have two other pieces of legislation which are still coming up. One is indeed state aid guidelines, how to, especially in this first phase, help to support the uptake of renewable and production of hydrogen in general. And then the other one is, of course, the hydrogen regulation. Looking at it as a very nascent market where it's very small at the moment. How can we already put principles in place such that it can be scaled up as the scale of the production and consumption of hydrogen goes over time. And then I think last but not least, that also, of course, comes the element of infrastructure in place. And that's why we are already today looking at, for example, proposals on the European kind of energy network infrastructures, both in terms of pipelines as well as the transport infrastructure in terms of hydrogen refueling stations. We want to incentivize this already today because we know it's going to take a long time. So having that in place or starting to work on that today will then enable us after 2030 to have that infrastructure in place. So with that, I hope I gave like a brief overview of how we view this demand versus supply a question, and happy to discuss that later.
Thanks, Ruud. Yes, you fit a lot into a short period of time. Yeah, very interesting point. I think, especially on this thing you raise of having to act on certain policies now, infrastructure, for example, but also imports, as Alison raised, when the real demand for it, and we're going to see them used a bit into the future, but we need to make the decisions already today, which is difficult. But now let me hand over to Andrea Pisano, who is head of hydrogen initiatives at Eni, of course, one of the largest oil and gas companies in Europe, and also an investor in low carbon technologies and with a keen eye on hydrogen. I think, as I've just found out, including in the UK. So yeah, exciting times for Eni. And Andre, thanks for joining us. And yeah, some opening remarks. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I would just give you the perspective of a large energy company like Eni that is facing an important challenge. Let me say a dual challenge, because we need to ensure to satisfy an increasing demand, energy demand, with a secure and stable and reliable and low-cost energy supply, while reducing the carbon footprint of our products and services. This is a huge challenge, and we need to activate all the levers we have, since we have set the carbon neutrality target by 2050, and so we need to evolve our portfolio of products and services, and hydrogen is part of the solution. Let me say, it is important to understand that there is a huge complexity behind the energy transition, and we need to be able to manage it by activating all the levers we have. And hydrogen is one of that. It's not the only one, because it is not the holy grail. Currently, we are experiencing an hydrogen momentum, and it seems that hydrogen could solve all the problems, but it is not. It is, we have to activate all the tools we have in our pocket. And about hydrogen, we have to understand that there is already an hydrogen market, which is responsible for CO2 emissions, and it is a priority. It is an issue and an opportunity, let me say. An issue because it is responsible around 900 million tons of CO2 on a global level. And it is an opportunity because it could be a driver to start a low carbon hydrogen market. So we believe that this is a priority, since we have been producing and consuming hydrogen in our refineries for decades. And currently we are using it in biorefineries, for example. That could represent a good driver to further develop the hydrogen market in the future, since it is used as a feedstock to produce bio-based fuels. And then, in addition, we can develop further applications. But further application like industrial hard-to-abate sectors, so industrial heating or heavy-duty transportation, need to technology development, and need to have to maintain their competitiveness. So in order to do this, we have to be able to supply a low-cost hydrogen. So let me say that we have to define a proper pathway. We know the initial stage, we know the starting point, which is an hydrogen market used as a feedstock, which is the most valuable use of hydrogen. And then we know which is the final target, a global market, an interconnected market with infrastructures. So we need to define this pathway to evolve from a market maybe mainly related to own consumption to this global market. And it is commonly recognized that a good step could be represented by hydrogen valleys, for example, that are an ecosystem that ensure the presence of a demand, and production facilities, and that justify the realization of infrastructures. So getting back to what the previous speaker said, it is important to move along the value chain together. So large energy companies, O&M, all the actors must move together, must go together toward the same objective, ensuring that we activate the levers that are most effective for that applications. And let me say that we have to keep in mind that our purpose is not to promote a product or a specific technology, but our purpose is to reduce the GHG emissions. So we have a powerful tool to compare which is the more effective solution. That is the price for CO2 avoided. That is a good indicator to compare different technologies and understand which is the best one for that application. So just to conclude that I'm available to elaborate more on these points, creating a pathway means to have a good standards and codes harmonized on a European level, policies to support hydrogen since it is not yet cost competitive, and we want to maintain the competitiveness of industrial sectors, and cooperate on different levels. So national level, local level, European level, and between actors of the energy sector and O&M. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andre. It's very interesting to hear you begin to talk about some of the key policies which you need to move forward in this area, and hopefully that's something we can get a bit more into. But let me now hand over to Matthias Deutsch, who is program leader of hydrogen at Agora. In Germany, climate and hydrogen are big topics. Germany is betting big on hydrogen, and particularly Agora. I would point out they have a very nice paper making renewable hydrogen cost competitive, which I've read and enjoyed, and I would recommend to others, and where I think Matthias will perhaps present something from today. But over to you, Matthias, for some opening comments.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, let me start with maybe the description of what we often hear when we talk about hard to abate sectors. And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we think it's misleading to talk about sectors, because where hydrogen is actually needed, it's more looking at the subsectoral level of individual applications. And I brought you a little overview of how we think about this, because we really think, you should by now see a colorful table, I hope. The way we think about this is that there are in all sectors that are currently typically used, industry, transport, power, buildings, there is a limited set of no regret applications that really truly need renewable hydrogen to become climate neutral. That's the objective, net zero, climate neutrality. And it helps a lot to focus on where it's really needed, where it's a no regret application. And we heard some of them by Andrea, for example, when he said feedstock. That's important, that's in the industry cell. And you see then long-haul aviation, long-haul shipping, and power sector for renewables backup. And then, not to forget, there is a residual heat load in many existing district heating systems in Central Northern Europe, where you cannot, if you cannot cover everything with renewables, you will need to cover this residual heat load somehow. So a bunch of no-regret applications we see in all sectors, but it's important to also realize then there's the yellow and the red part. And in the yellow part, it's way more controversial. High temperature heat. You can do a lot of direct electric applications, infrared, plasma. There are different ways of producing high temperature heat. So it's controversy what the substitute might be. And there's also discussion on trucks and buses, short-haul aviation and shipping. And then in the end, the red line, then there are what we think are really bad ideas. And why are we making this distinction, those three categories? Because hydrogen is not competitive today, low carbon hydrogen. If this is about using taxpayers' money for supporting something, we need a sufficient consensus in society where to put this money. And we strongly recommend, as long as carbon pricing and the ETS cannot do the job to bring hydrogen into the market, taxpayers' money should be spent wisely by focusing on no-regret applications. This is why I brought you this overview. We think this is very important as kind of to steer the discussion to the right applications. Now, let me get back to kind of some more remarks. along this line of focusing on no regrets, we should also look at where infrastructure should be developed. As Ruth mentioned about using existing, repurposing existing infrastructure, maybe developing some new pipelines here and there. This should also focus on connecting industrial clusters, no regret clusters that truly need this hydrogen. And at the TSO level, we then don't need to blend anything because we know that some industries clearly need pure hydrogen, 100% hydrogen. So for us, it's out of question to further discuss, which isn't being done anyway in many circles, to just consider the idea of blending hydrogen into natural gas grids at the TSO level. Industry, as Andrea also mentioned, needs hydrogen to remain competitive. We see a global race, for example, to green steel making. It needs a fast ramp up of capacities because investment cycles are important and some decisions need to be taken in this decade. And so we can't wait if we want to become climate neutral in industry as well. So all of this needs fast renewables deployment, additional renewables deployment. We have this discussion, and I guess we'll get a bit more into details later. Renewables deployment is a challenge, not only for hydrogen, but in general in Europe. We need to be faster and better at doing that. And I can tell you from Germany, it's very obvious that that's in the center of discussions for the upcoming German government, how to increase the speed, pace of renewables deployment. Now, if we cannot deliver that in time, we deem it possible that there is this period where industry needs to deliver on decarbonization and the entire industrial transformation. And if then there's not enough additional renewable hydrogen available fast enough, the question of fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture certainly comes to the table. And we heard a bit about that. Now, the question is, how fast can that be scaled then? With strong requirements, because the objective is still climate neutrality. And any major investments now in this decade has implications for the longer run. So we need to start out with sufficiently strict requirements also for fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture. So that means a solid regulatory framework, both for carbon capture and the control of fugitive emissions. Now we think, just to finish this line of thought, for carbon capture, really, this is not about using lower standards, but striving for high, like let's say at least 90% carbon capture rate. And for new installations, because I was talking about retrofit, for new installations, we should strive for something like 98%. And similarly, for fugitive upstream methane emissions, that shouldn't exceed something that had been proposed by the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative of 0.2% for production as of 2025. In the long run, should be a reduction to 0.05%, because again, the objective is climate neutrality. And we can't think about kind of having long-living assets producing fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture and then getting closer to 2045, 2050 and not having those high restrictions. Because in the end, if you really talk about climate neutrality, any remaining greenhouse gas emissions would then, by that target date, be compensated by additional negative emissions, rendering the entire exercise more expensive, more difficult. So with that in mind, I think idea is, let's be fast and good with renewable hydrogen, focus on no regret applications, as I showed you in the table, putting sufficient policy support into those, relating the infrastructure to that, don't blend at the TSO level, and making sure that industry remains competitive in the race for climate neutrality by supplying what industry needs for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So now we have just under half an hour remaining and we come to the discussion, which should be very interesting. Initially, I would pose a couple of questions to you, but I would also encourage you, if you had some remarks based on the other speakers, please feel free to also make these comments. And then we'll go to Slido, where I've mentioned on Slido with the event code hydrogen, or just beneath this stream if you're watching on the Bruegel website. Maybe first I wanted to come to you, Andre, because I mentioned at the end of your remarks, but I would be interested to get your perspective with policymakers sitting here on what the biggest obstacles are to make this transformation, as you described, from a chemical feedstock to a traded, potentially energy commodity, and hydrogen playing a big role in decarbonisation. You mentioned that with the UK, as I understood now with HyNet, you're potentially involved in this agreement. And I wonder what are the, I mean, is it the policy support? Is it the commitment from high levels that hydrogen will play a big role in future systems that makes you confident to invest? And in other areas, what is it holding you back? That if you could ask for the one thing, what would it be? You know, infrastructure, policy support? Is it a regulation? You need clear regulation and clear signals about what will be deemed as low carbon or acceptable hydrogen. Maybe you can talk to this.
Yes, thank you. Well, when I talk about developing the market, it is important to define the rules of the game. So it is not just the regulatory framework from, let me say, an economical point of view, but also about standards in terms of be aligned about the, for example, blending limit in existing infrastructures. We have to define harmonized code and standards on a European level. And then about the policies to support the market, you have two instruments, let me say. One is to cover the gap between new products and the existing one with, for example, a contract for difference. And in that case, because the hydrogen consumers today, for example, want to be indifferent respect to the final price. So they want to pay hydrogen at the same price level as the gray one. So the government should support these industries in switching to low carbon or renewable hydrogen by ensuring that they can have a final price for their products that is still competitive on a global market. So that's the reason why I say that the priority is to decarbonize, but it is to maintain competitiveness of industrial sectors. So how to do that? You can set an obligation on the percentage of hydrogen that must be low carbon or renewable, or you can support with an instrument like contract for difference. Or they can be both a solution, they can be part of the solution. But it is important to ensure that for new producers, you can cover the volume risk. So how can you do that? By diversifying the demand. You need to have several off-takers. That's the reason why Hydrogen Valley represents a good starting point, because a production facilities could have several off-takers in the industrial heating, in the heavy-duty transportation. So in that case, you can lower the risk related to volumes. And then, for sure, to enable the market, you need the government support to minimize this risk, because we are on the starting line with our investments. We have more than 10 million tons announced of low carbon projects by 2030. But in order to make them, we need to understand which is the real pathway and how to consider the hydrogen we are going to produce. So a certification scheme is necessary in order to have a price that is strictly connected to the real carbon footprint of the hydrogen that we are going to use. So certification scheme, code standards, policy support are the rules of the game. And we are waiting for this to start our projects. So I believe that this is the priority in order to speed up the hydrogen market development.
Thanks, that's very interesting. I would think in line with the policy thinking also that certification of hydrogen, including hydrogen imports, is one of the key blocks that we need to get right. And indeed, that's the next question I would like to come to around imports, also which has been raised on Slido by a couple of anonymous writers, so I can't say their names. But with Alison and Ruud both here, I think one of the burning questions that I would like to ask is on imports. And I mean, the general question of how will we think about imports, which in the EU, I guess, with the gas package coming forward, that maybe will be discussed here. You know, what can we import? What are the kind of regulations that we will develop to determine the imports that we allow? But then maybe particularly here on this UK and EU relationship, how do you see this going forward? I mean, is it feasible that the European Union will be importing blue hydrogen from the UK in 2035, or maybe this is not feasible in line with the strategy? But your takes on this general question of imports, and then potentially, if you can, particularly the UK and the EU's relationship, I would hand over to Alison first. And as I said, also feel free to make comments if you had anything on earlier speakers. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben, and keen to hear Ruud's thoughts as well. Yeah, happy to speak on this. So I guess we, as I mentioned before, we think there's a really important role for a global market in hydrogen. At the moment, our kind of strategy outlines that that's a market we expect to really start to kind of take effect kind of in the 2030s, or that imports certainly to the UK, we expect to be playing a strategic role in the 2030s. And certainly at the moment, you know, our priority is getting our domestic production capacity up and running. And that's why a lot of the policy instruments we've announced are focused on that. So I was really interested to hear Andrea's points there, and certainly kind of price and volume risk are things that we're trying to take into account in the way we design policies, as well as setting a standard. That said, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think we think it's really important that the steps we take as policymakers now are anticipating that future market. So from the UK side, it's about getting a low carbon hydrogen standard in place so that we know that any hydrogen that we're producing in the UK is sufficiently low carbon. And that's the standard that we're consulting on at the moment. And it's based on a lot of thorough kind of technical advice, and we really welcome input. Actually, it's the consultation's open for the rest of the week, so people are into that, please do feed in. And I think certainly we see that as a really good basis to look at then some kind of a certification scheme that could work for global trade in hydrogen as well. So that's certainly what we're doing, and we really welcome the idea of continuing to kind of collaborate and work together on creating that global market. You know, as I mentioned at the start, we think the UK's got good assets to make hydrogen, and we think we've got really kind of good controls in place to make sure that any hydrogen that we make is sufficiently low carbon to put us on track to you know, net zero emissions. So with those two things in mind, it feels like we've got a really helpful role potentially to play in that global market, and certainly hope that our European neighbours and colleagues think that's the case too.
Maybe
over to you, Ruud.
Yes, following up straight on with, indeed, I think the first thing I wanted to say, and I think Andrea, you did this as well. You know, we have already quite a big consumption of fossil-based hydrogen today, and actually Europe is already trading that through private networks across a couple of member states. So this is already something which is happening, and I think that's really indeed why also from an EU perspective, we came up with this idea of having sub-targets for industries at member state level, because we do think that all across the EU, there are opportunities for hydrogen, either to produce it or to consume it. And that the trade and their trade of what we call the renewable fuels of non-biological origin, but essentially electrolysis-based hydrogen from renewable electricity, is an opportunity there to really kind of initiate in this trade. So in the Renewable Energy Directive proposal which we've put in place, essentially what we say is that we've got experience with biofuels and certification, which is already a commodity which is traded globally. And what we want to do for renewable hydrogen is to simply extend that. So use the same methodologies which we've used for example, verifying that a biofuel is sustainable, and use the same certification schemes also for renewable hydrogen. And in that way, indeed, renewable hydrogen can be traded across member states, but it can also be imported from third countries. And with that, we're also proposing to essentially change the accounting rules such that those member states who want to import can then also claim that renewable hydrogen as their contribution towards the overall European target of 40% renewables in 2030. Now, the hydrogen package coming up later this year, our idea is to complement this so that we don't only have it for renewable hydrogen in the Renewable Energy Directive, but also for low carbon hydrogen for those hydrogen production which is produced either from fossil fuels or maybe from electricity which is carbon free. So we say there we need to have a certain standard in terms of CO2 greenhouse gas emissions across the full value chain, indeed, as mentioned before, and also as we highlighted in the strategy. Also, of course, in taking into account any emissions associated with the production and also transport of hydrogen, especially if you go over long distances. And there, of course, transport in pipelines is, of course, in terms of efficiency options and reducing emissions, a very interesting way to look at trade from the EU with third countries. And of course, then you look already in the neighborhood at what those options are there. We think also that with our sub-targets for 2030, we already have set kind of a certain demand for Europe. And we've communicated it also to third parties. So this is what we think is needed as a minimum. But I think what Matthias also said before is that maybe if the steel sector wants to go quicker than what we can produce in Europe, we need to make sure that hydrogen can be delivered to the steel sector to make those investments happen. So this sub-target is really a minimum for us, but we think that, of course, trade will be indispensable, especially in the scale up after 2030, to make this all happen.
Thanks very much, Ruud and Alison. If I can offer my interpretation of your comments, I think you actually sounded both quite aligned on, I mean, thinking through transparent framework for measuring the emissions associated with hydrogen production, being slightly neutral about, from an ideological perspective, how this is produced, but you know, very thorough and understanding the exact emissions, including fugitive and from transmission, which is nice to be on the same page. As I understood, of course, that's extremely difficult, and I mean that will take some administrative work, but that's interesting and nice to hear your thoughts. If I can turn to you, Matthias, with the paper that you published and your comments now, some of my interpretation was kind of some warnings towards what not to think on hydrogen, which I think is quite sensible given the debate explodes and everybody talks about it for everything. And I saw particularly, I mean, with your discussion on where this should be consumed and where you think, and also your perspectives on which kind of hydrogen should be consumed, where again, I might, from your remarks today, interpret that you have not an issue necessarily with blue hydrogen, but you just want very, very clear. I mean, you mentioned 98% capture rates here, so you want very strict regulations. My question would be, what is the biggest mistake that policymakers could now make when trying to push forward hydrogen? So slightly inverse perhaps of what Andrea discussed, but what is the thing that the biggest thing you don't want them to do, or that you're slightly scared of and you would strongly advise against policymakers doing in the next year or so?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I come up with two answers to this. I think for one answer is just essentially repeating that what we see is that given the high hopes for hydrogen in about every application you can think of, and it's fair that anybody doing research and development wants his pet project to be supported, because hydrogen is not competitive today, low carbon hydrogen, especially renewable hydrogen, then still keeping in mind that governmental budgets are somehow limited in the policy process, the political process, and therefore spending it wisely and supporting what we call no regret, I think is still important. And doing the opposite, just throwing out support for any kind of hydrogen in any application, I think would be deviating us from this competitive angle. I think there is competition ongoing. Green steel is not a European dream. It's something going on across the planet. And being fast enough, some of my colleagues say maybe the industry sector will be kind of the fastest sector to be decarbonized faster than others, because there's such a momentum there that focusing kind of society's efforts and resources on those things that really matter, where competition will be increasing. I think doing the opposite means, well, we don't have enough effort, don't have enough to be competitive. So that I think will be the industry angle. The competitiveness angle, and the other one, because it is a scarce resource, as long as we haven't gone through this learning curve with the kind of fantastic capital expenditure where electrolyzers get super cheap, and ETS is not high enough, carbon prices aren't high enough, there is a role for government. That's, I think, to be kept in mind. Biggest thing, the other thing, as I said, is for fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture, just thinking that, oh, let's do the regulation for this decade, and maybe some years later, in the end, not forgetting about climate neutrality. I think that would be a mistake, because we can see for some, I think, players using existing technology and saying we have an add-on and then we go low carbon. It is somehow low carbon, but this will not help us with finding this way to climate neutrality in the long run. And those things are probably not used for 5 to 10 years. This is about asset lifetimes and anticipating, as Alison said, some risks, yes, but also lifetimes, and then asking into what kind of lock-in we may run with certain investments.
Thanks very much, Matthias. I saw you nodding, Alison. I didn't know if you want to come in on this. So I don't know. Then we turn again to some questions from Slido, and I would bring two together. The most voted question on Slido is asking the role of hydrogen in net zero, which I felt we had discussed a bit. And I mean, you came forward with your terawatt-hour figures from the studies, but maybe we can zoom out and try to provide a perspective on this, maybe in terms of some of the other elements going on. I mean, Matthias talked a lot about the importance of renewable deployment, and I think placing this above, I would assume, hydrogen in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I would let whoever likes to speak, or all of you, really a zoomed out question, and we've gone very deep, but just, and I know we have kind of addressed this question, but in your own words, how important hydrogen is to achieve this net zero target by 2050.
Do you want me to start? Yeah, no, I think because I know there was a question about the kind of UK having just published our net zero strategy, which we have. And I think I mentioned, but just to repeat, I think both we as a government and our independent climate change committee have both said that we see hydrogen as being essential in reaching that goal. And I know there was a related question about the kind of proportion of final end use. And I think it's between 20% and 35% of energy in 2050 we'd anticipate the hydrogen economy contributing. So it's, it is a sizable chunk. I don't know if it's worth kind of talking a little bit about sectors. So I think Matthias makes some really interesting points, and certainly I think it's one of the challenges for us all with the hydrogen economy is we know this is an energy carrier with huge amounts of potential, but we know in almost every sector there are also alternative technologies to deploy, and making those decisions wisely and kind of keeping that flexibility for these sectors to develop in very different ways over the coming years is going to be really important. So as I think I've mentioned, we've set out ranges, and I won't kind of go through and list them all, but we have set out ranges for the role of hydrogen that we see, and we see it in industry, we see a role in power sector, we see it in transportation, we see it in buildings as well. And in each of those sectors, obviously there's a kind of whole range of decarbonisation tools to be looking at, and hydrogen's just kind of one of those, and that's why we've got such large ranges with hydrogen. And I think I'm sure policymakers right across Europe are grappling with the same questions, which is this is an economy that we really need to kickstart, and we're going to have to kind of build this plane and fly it at the same time, because in each of those sectors there's a lot of technologies to choose from. So I'd kind of maybe stop there, but happy to dive into more detail.
Thanks. Ruud, I see you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one element which I feel we haven't talked about a lot, but still we think is very important, and that is indeed we're looking at like hydrogen to decarbonize our end-use applications, as Mattia rightly mentioned, but we also see it as very as an opportunity for creating synergies with what we think is going to be a renewables-based electricity system. The share of renewable power, especially variable renewable power in our energy system, will continue to rise. We think it's going to be more than 2/3 in 2030 already. And we really think that renewable hydrogen there, its production can really provide a benefit to this kind of integrated energy system. So not only the production and then the use in the end use applications, but indeed also as kind of a buffering option for seasonal storage, or to bring very cheap renewables from those places where it is being produced a lot to those places which at the end of the day need to consume it. So that's why also our long-term priority is renewable hydrogen, because we really see those synergies there with our future energy system.
Matthias, feel free to comment.
Just a short addition, maybe in about 1 month from now, we'll come out with a new publication, Hydrogen. I think what we see when we compare different scenarios for Europe and the world, I think our take on what the contribution of hydrogen to final energy, the share is more on the order of 10 to 20%. I mean, 10 is really low, but 2024, that's what we rather see as the max for a range of scenarios. So I think that's a bit less ambitious there. And the one, because you asked me about risks, one more thought about risks. This is a more informed expert level discussion here. What I can tell you from Germany is also from our kind of election campaigns is some people somehow manage in the policymaker sphere to disconnect the idea of hydrogen from where it comes from. And that is maybe actually the biggest danger in that political game, is to just abstract and say, we'll need a lot of hydrogen, period. And this is what Ruud just referred to. No, the question is, what is the underlying long-term basis of those vast amounts of volumes of hydrogen? And that's what we need to communicate. Otherwise, there will be major challenges with the needed renewables scale up as the underlying basis in the long run. And I think that's a real, at least in Germany, it's a true issue to communicate it to the non-expert audience.
Andre?
Yes, just a quick consideration about from a production point of view. I totally agree that hydrogen is the best partner for electricity, and we see the electrification as an important process to decarbonize industries as well, but it is not enough, because we need to activate the further levers, and we need to act now, because the first target is by 2030, and we need to start and to speed up our process. In order to do that, we need to assess which are the options that are still viable, are already viable. And for example, blue hydrogen is a good option to retrofit the existing facilities and to ensure large volumes that are necessary, for example, in the refining sector, in biorefining sector, in ammonia production. We can ensure stable and large volumes with a cost competitive, cost competitive from the production point of view. So I think that we need to encompass two solutions. Let me say, a blue hydrogen in the short term, while developing green hydrogen in parallel, waiting for the cost reduction of the electrolyzers and waiting for additional electricity, because this is a point already touched by previous speakers. The pace of renewable installation is a critical point, in particular in Italy. We have less than 1 gigawatt per year of installed capacity of renewables, and we should increase this pace to up to 7-8 gigawatt per year. It is a huge challenge. So we need to dedicate the megawatt hour from renewables, which is something really valuable, to decarbonize the power sector. And then when we will have additional renewable capacity, we can start to produce large volumes of green hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Andre and all, for the very interesting comments. We are very quickly approaching the end of our time, which is unfortunate because I think there's still many more questions to be discussed. I would give you all the chance for some closing comments. First, though, I want to just at least point out another topic which was raised in the Slido about the question of e-fuels. One person raising e-fuels, the role they might play in final demand, and another person raising them more from the import and transport perspective, where longer term transport of hydrogen, if we think about harnessing renewables in other parts of the world, are quite likely to be in ammonia or other transformed fuels from hydrogen. We don't have time to go into this topic. I mean, it adds another layer of complexity. We haven't got time to go into it properly. But I would now give back the floor to each four of you for 30-second to 1 minute closing remarks. If you have something interesting on this, please say it. But yeah, your closing remarks and your feeling going forward on hydrogen, and then we will unfortunately have to close the session. Let's go to Alice in the same order as last time to close. Thanks.
Yikes. So thanks. I think that's been really fascinating. I guess from our perspective, we'd say, you know, the time is now to get going. That's why we want to start with both blue and green hydrogen. And as I've said, some really ambitious timeframes for deployment just laid out this week. So we're excited to get going. We're excited to work with partners. We hope that we can work together to get that kind of global platform for trade in low carbon hydrogen in place when time allows. But yeah, we've really enjoyed that. So thanks, everyone.
Good.
Yeah, for me, I wanted to maybe, listening to our whole discussion, reiterate again something which we also published in our hydrogen strategy more than a year ago now. That is that we really have to think of this ecosystem as a whole, and not just production and supply, but also, you know, how we're going to get it there. What do we do with storage? Something which we even haven't discussed about. Indeed, the conversion of hydrogen into other fuels, etc. Really keeping this perspective in place and then building up this hydro ecosystem as a whole, I think is going to be critical in order to ensure that we kind of have the pace needed to also get not only to the 2030 targets, but then also to scale up afterwards.
Matthias?
Yes, I think this perspective of global trade is an important one because it shows also other countries outside of Europe that there is something that we can offer as a perspective and as something to get gains from trade internationally. And in that respect, I think it's important that after all we know, for at least for some applications like jet fuel, synthetic jet fuel, there is a need for carbon-containing molecules going beyond ammonia. And in that sense, some of the countries far away are in a really good position. They have the space and the possibilities for tapping a sustainable source of carbon in order to derive something like Fischer-Tropsch fuel or synthetic jet fuel. That's something that's easier to import, doesn't cost as much. It's like a drop in. We can use existing assets. And that's, I think, it's the contribution in long range transport and imports where others can also get into this game and Europe will benefit from it.
Thanks, Matthias. We should have introduced that question earlier to get a bit more into it, but thanks. And Andrea, over to you.
Yes, just consideration of e-fuels. I believe that e-fuels can be the refineries of the future because you can combine green hydrogen with CO2 bio-based, for example, in order to produce the same products you already are producing with refineries. So that's a good point, but it is very very expensive to produce this fuel. So it is an opportunity for the future. Then let me just underline the point that it is not sufficient to define the target, the final target for the hydrogen market development. We need to set a pathway which is different for each sectors of final application. So we need to understand the needs of each sector and define, and year by year, switching towards low carbon products in order to assess which is the technological feasibility and which are the needs in terms of competitiveness from an economic point of view. And in order to do this, it is important to start a dialogue and to continue to dialogue on national level and between actors of the entire value chain.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks to all of you for joining on this lively and interesting discussion. Thanks to everybody at home who we cannot see but have joined, and for the questions you provided on Slido, which were very interesting. So I think over the next months we'll learn a lot more from the UK, from Europe, also from Agora here, another paper, and from Eni. I'm sure there'll be more projects forthcoming, and also from Bruegel. We will keep working on this topic. So I look forward to more discussions and more developments in this area over the coming months. And have a nice day. Goodbye.
Thank you.